Sarah Mitchell stepped off the plane at Manila International Airport, the humid air hitting her face like a warm blanket. She pulled her sunglasses down and looked around at the busy terminal. People rushed past her with their luggage, speaking in languages she didn't understand. The smell of street food and tropical flowers mixed in the air. This was supposed to be a simple vacation, her first real break in 3 years. At 34, Sarah had lived more adventures than most people twice her age. She spent 8 years as a combat pilot in the Air Force, flying dangerous missions over mountains and deserts. Her hands were steady, her mind sharp, and her record spotless. But the constant stress and sleepless nights had taken their toll. When her service ended 2 years ago, she decided to step away from flying completely. Now she worked as a flight instructor at a small airport in Colorado, teaching nervous students how to land single-engine planes. The Philippines trip was a gift from her sister Emma, who worried that Sarah spent too much time alone. Emma had booked everything: the flight, the hotel, even some tours around the islands. "You need to remember how to have fun," Emma had said while handing over the tickets. Sarah wasn't sure she remembered how to relax, but she was willing to try. Her hotel was a simple place near the beach. Nothing fancy, but clean and comfortable. The owner, Mrs. Santos, was a cheerful woman in her 60s who spoke excellent English. She showed Sarah to her room on the second floor, chattering about the best places to eat and the most beautiful beaches to visit. Through the window, Sarah could see palm trees swaying in the breeze and boats floating in the crystal-clear water. That evening, Sarah walked along the beach as the sun set behind the horizon. The sand was soft between her toes, and the sound of waves was peaceful. For the first time in months, she felt her shoulders relax. Maybe Emma was right. Maybe she did need this break from her routine life back home. She found a small restaurant by the water and ordered grilled fish with rice. The food was delicious, and the friendly waitress taught her a few words in Tagalog. Other tourists sat at nearby tables laughing and taking pictures. Sarah watched them and wondered if she looked as relaxed as they did. Probably not. Even on vacation, her eyes automatically scanned the area, noting exits and checking for anything unusual. Old habits from her military training died hard. The next morning, Sarah woke up early and decided to explore the town. She rented a small motorcycle and rode through narrow streets lined with colorful houses. Children waved at her from doorways, and vendors called out greetings as she passed their stalls selling fresh fruit and handmade crafts. The town was alive with energy and warmth that she rarely experienced in her quiet Colorado neighborhood. She stopped at a local market where an elderly man was selling wood carvings. His weathered hands moved skillfully as he shaped a small bird from a piece of mahogany. When he saw her watching, he smiled and explained his work in broken English. His name was Miguel, and he had been carving for 50 years. Sarah bought a small eagle, thinking it would remind her of this peaceful place when she returned home. That afternoon, she visited a small aviation museum on the edge of town. The building was old and dusty, but it contained fascinating displays about Philippine aviation history. An ancient propeller plane sat in the center of the main room, its paint faded but its structure still strong. Sarah ran her fingers along the wing, feeling the familiar texture of aircraft metal. The museum keeper, a retired pilot named Carlos, noticed her interest and struck up a conversation. Carlos had flown commercial airlines for 30 years before retiring to run the museum. When he learned about Sarah's military background, his eyes lit up with excitement. They spent hours talking about different aircraft, sharing stories about challenging flights and close calls. Carlos showed her his collection of old flight manuals and photographs of famous Filipino pilots. For the first time since leaving the military, Sarah felt connected to her past without the weight of bad memories. As evening approached, Carlos invited her to join him and some friends for dinner at his house. His wife Maria prepared a feast of traditional dishes, while Carlos and his pilot friends shared more aviation stories. They asked Sarah about her combat experience, and she found herself opening up in ways she hadn't expected. These people understood the bond between pilots, the trust required to take a machine into the sky and bring it safely back to Earth. Walking back to her hotel that night, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time, a sense of belonging. The warm evening air carried the scent of jasmine flowers, and the streets were alive with music from small bars and restaurants. Groups of friends sat on porches talking and laughing late into the night. This community felt different from the cold efficiency of military bases or the isolation of her current job. She sat on her hotel balcony, listening to the waves and thinking about the day. Maybe this vacation would be more than just a break from routine. Maybe it would help her figure out what came next in her life. She had been drifting since leaving the Air Force, going through the motions but not really living. The warmth of the people here, their genuine interest in her stories, made her realize how much she missed feeling connected to something meaningful. Sarah pulled out her phone and sent a text to Emma. "You were right. This place is exactly what I needed. Thank you for making me come here." As she prepared for bed, she looked forward to exploring more of the island tomorrow. She had no idea that in just 2 days everything would change. She had no idea that her quiet vacation was about to become the most important mission of her life. She had no idea that her military training, which she thought she had left behind forever, would soon be the only thing standing between hundreds of people and disaster. The third day of Sarah's vacation started like any other tropical morning. She woke up to the sound of roosters crowing and children playing in the street below. The sun was already warm, promising another beautiful day for exploring. She had planned to take a boat tour to some nearby islands, something completely different from her usual mountain hiking back in Colorado. After breakfast, Sarah walked to the small harbor where dozens of boats waited for tourists. The water was so clear she could see fish swimming near the bottom. Tour guides called out in multiple languages, trying to attract customers for island-hopping trips. She chose a medium-sized boat with a friendly captain named Rico, who promised to show her the most beautiful spots in the area. The boat held about 15 other tourists, families with children, young couples taking selfies, and a group of college students on spring break. Sarah found a seat near the back where she could enjoy the view without being caught in conversations. The engine rumbled to life and they pulled away from the dock, heading toward a cluster of small islands visible in the distance. As they traveled across the open water, Sarah felt more relaxed than she had in years. The wind whipped through her hair and the spray from the waves cooled her skin. She watched dolphins playing in the boat's wake and marveled at how blue the water was. This was exactly the kind of peace she had been searching for without even knowing it. Their first stop was a tiny island with a perfect white sand beach. The tourists scattered to swim, snorkel, and take pictures. Sarah waded into the warm water and floated on her back, staring up at the cloudless sky. A small fish brushed against her leg and she laughed out loud. When was the last time she had laughed like that? She couldn't remember. After an hour of swimming and exploring, they loaded back onto the boat for the trip to the second island. This one was larger, with a small village where local families sold fresh coconuts and grilled seafood. Sarah bought a coconut and sat in the shade, watching children play soccer on the beach while their parents worked nearby. The simplicity of it all amazed her. These people seemed genuinely happy with their quiet island life. As they prepared to leave for their final destination, Sarah noticed something that made her military instincts kick in. Dark clouds were building rapidly on the horizon, moving faster than any normal weather pattern she had seen. The wind was picking up too, causing the boat to rock more than it had earlier. She approached Captain Rico, who was studying the sky with concern. "That storm looks serious," Sarah said, pointing toward the approaching clouds. "Should we head back?" Rico shook his head, but his expression was troubled. It came from nowhere. "Weather report said clear skies all day. We go to Last Island quickly, then return before it reaches us." But Sarah had seen weather change fast before, especially during her combat missions. This felt different, more dangerous than a typical afternoon storm. She could feel the pressure dropping and see the way the waves were starting to build. Her gut told her they should turn around immediately, but she wasn't the captain. She was just a tourist on vacation. The boat sped toward the third island, but the storm moved faster than anyone expected. Within 30 minutes, the sky had turned dark gray and the wind was howling. Waves that had been gentle were now 3 feet high and growing. The tourists who had been laughing and taking pictures were now gripping their seats as the boat pitched and rolled. Captain Rico made the smart decision to skip the third island and head straight back to the main harbor. But as they turned around, Sarah realized they had a serious problem. The storm wasn't just moving toward them, it was surrounding them. What had started as dark clouds on the horizon was now a full tropical storm with driving rain and dangerous winds. The boat struggled against waves that were now over 6 feet tall. Water poured over the sides with each wave, and several tourists were getting seasick. The college students who had been joking around were now quiet and scared. Mothers held their children close as fathers tried to look brave. Sarah moved toward the front of the boat where Rico was fighting to control the wheel. "How far to shore?" she shouted over the wind. 20 minutes in good weather," Rico yelled back. "Maybe 40 minutes in this." Sarah looked at the fuel gauge and her heart sank. The engine was working harder than expected against the waves and wind, burning fuel faster than normal. At this rate, they might not make it back before running out of gas. And even if they did have enough fuel, she wasn't sure the boat could handle much more of this beating. A particularly large wave crashed over the bow, sending tourists scrambling toward the back of the boat. Sarah noticed that water was starting to accumulate in the bottom, despite the small pump that was supposed to keep them dry. The boat was taking on more water than it could remove. If this continued, they would sink long before reaching shore. Rico was a good captain, but Sarah could see the panic starting to show in his eyes. He had probably never faced conditions this severe with a boat full of tourists. His hands were shaking as he gripped the wheel, and sweat mixed with rain on his face despite the cool wind. Sarah made a decision that surprised even her. "Rico, let me help," she said, moving closer to him. "I have experience with emergency situations." Rico looked at her with confusion and desperation. "You know boats?" "Not boats, but I know storms and I know how to stay calm under pressure," Sarah replied. "What do you need me to do?" Before Rico could answer, another massive wave hit them from the side, nearly knocking several people overboard. The boat tilted at a dangerous angle before righting itself. Sarah heard screaming from the tourists and knew they were running out of time. She had spent years training for crisis situations, learning to think clearly when everything around her was chaos. Looking at the other boats in the distance, Sarah realized they were all heading for the same harbor. That meant dozens of boats would be trying to dock at the same time in dangerous conditions. It would be chaos, and smaller boats like theirs might not be able to get close enough to shore safely. They needed a different plan, and they needed it fast. The storm was getting worse by the minute. Sarah watched as waves crashed over the boat's sides, sending tourists sliding across the wet deck. A young mother clutched her toddler, both of them soaked and shivering. The college students had stopped their nervous joking and were now openly scared. Everyone was looking around with the same question in their eyes. Were they going to make it? Sarah moved through the boat, checking on each group of passengers. Her military training kicked in automatically. In crisis situations, panic spread faster than fire, and once it took hold, people stopped thinking clearly. She needed to keep everyone calm while figuring out how to get them safely to shore. "Listen to me," she called out over the howling wind. "I know this is scary, but we're going to be okay. Stay low, hold on tight, and follow my instructions." Something in her voice made people listen. Maybe it was the confidence she projected, or maybe they were just desperate for someone to take charge. Either way, the panic seemed to ease slightly. Sarah continued moving through the boat, making sure everyone had life jackets and knew where to find them. Captain Rico was still fighting with the wheel, but Sarah could see he was losing the battle. The boat was being pushed further from shore by the wind and waves. The engine was working at full power, but they were barely making progress. Worse, the fuel gauge was dropping rapidly. At this rate, they would run out of gas while still miles from safety. "Rico, we need to change course," Sarah shouted. "The main harbor is too far and there are too many boats heading there. Is there anywhere closer we can land?" Rico thought for a moment, his eyes scanning the coastline barely visible through the rain. "There's a small beach about 2 miles north. No dock, but if we can get close enough, people might be able to wade to shore." Sarah nodded. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than running out of fuel in open water. "Do it. Head for the beach." As Rico turned the boat north, Sarah continued her assessment of their situation. The water level inside the boat was rising despite the pump working constantly. Several tourists were seasick and weak. The elderly man from Germany looked pale and was having trouble breathing. They needed to reach shore soon, or people were going to start getting seriously hurt. The wind shifted suddenly, and Sarah felt the boat shudder as it was hit by a wave from a different direction. This wasn't just a storm anymore. It was becoming something much more dangerous. The weather patterns reminded her of the violent storms she had encountered during missions in Afghanistan, where conditions could turn deadly in minutes. "Sarah," Rico called out. "Radio's not working. Can't call for help." This was worse than she thought. Without radio communication, no one on shore knew exactly where they were or that they needed assistance. Even if they made it close to the beach, there might not be anyone there to help them get safely to land. Sarah realized she needed to take more control of the situation. She made her way to the front of the boat where Rico was still struggling with the controls. The fuel gauge now showed less than a quarter tank. The engine was working so hard against the storm that it was burning fuel at twice the normal rate. They had maybe 20 minutes of power left, and they were still more than a mile from the beach. "Rico, I need you to do exactly what I tell you," Sarah said firmly. "I've been in situations like this before. We can make it, but only if we work together." Rico nodded, relief showing in his eyes. Having someone else take some of the responsibility seemed to calm him down. Sarah studied the waves and wind patterns, using skills she had learned during water survival training. Every storm had a rhythm, and if you could find it, you could use it to your advantage. "See how the waves are coming in sets?" she pointed out. "Big ones, then smaller ones, then big ones again. We need to ride the big waves and rest during the small ones. It'll save fuel and get us there faster." Rico followed her instructions, and immediately the boat started moving more efficiently. Instead of fighting every wave, they were working with the storm's natural pattern. The tourists noticed the difference too. The ride became slightly smoother and people started to look less terrified. But their problems weren't over. Sarah noticed that one of the college students, a young man named Mike, was starting to show signs of hypothermia. His lips were blue and he was shivering uncontrollably despite the warm tropical air. The combination of being soaked and scared was taking its toll on his body. If he got much worse, they would have a medical emergency on top of everything else. Sarah pulled off her own jacket and wrapped it around Mike, then had his friends move closer to share body heat. She showed them how to keep him talking and alert. In survival situations, small problems could quickly become life-threatening if ignored. Keeping everyone healthy and conscious was just as important as reaching shore. As they got closer to the beach, Sarah could see that her worst fears were coming true. The shoreline was rocky with dangerous waves crashing against the rocks. There was a small sandy area, but it was surrounded by coral reefs that could tear a boat apart. Landing there would require perfect timing and a lot of luck. "Rico, we're only going to get one chance at this," Sarah explained. "We need to time it perfectly with the waves. Too early and we hit the rocks. Too late and we get pushed back out to sea." Rico's hands were shaking as he prepared for the most difficult boat landing of his life. Sarah placed her hand on his shoulder, steadying him. "You can do this. I've seen pilots land planes in worse conditions. Just focus on my voice and do exactly what I say." The fuel gauge was now showing empty, but the engine was still running on the last drops in the tank. They would have one chance to reach the beach before the power died completely. Sarah watched the wave patterns, counting the timing between sets. Everything depended on the next few minutes. In the distance, she could see other boats struggling in the storm. Some were heading for the main harbor, but others looked like they were in serious trouble. One boat had already overturned and its passengers were in the water. Sarah realized that what was happening to them was happening all over the area. This wasn't just one boat in trouble. This was a disaster affecting hundreds of people. The engine sputtered once, twice, then died completely. They were still 50 yards from the beach, floating dead in the water as massive waves pushed them toward the rocky shoreline. Sarah felt the familiar calm that always came over her in truly dangerous situations. This was the moment when training mattered more than luck. "Everyone move to the center of the boat," she commanded. "Away from the sides." The passengers scrambled toward the middle as Sarah grabbed the emergency paddle from its holder. Rico found another paddle, and together they tried to steer the powerless boat toward the small sandy area between the rocks. Each wave pushed them closer to shore, but also closer to the jagged coral reef that could slice through the boat's hull like a knife. The young mother with the toddler started crying, thinking they were all going to die. Sarah caught her eye and spoke with firm reassurance. "Look at me. We're going to make it to shore. I need you to stay calm for your baby. Can you do that?" The woman nodded, wiping her tears. Sarah had learned that giving people specific tasks helped them focus instead of panic. "When we get close to the beach, I need you to hold your child tight and follow me into the water. Don't let go, no matter what." Another massive wave lifted the boat high into the air, then crashed it down into the trough behind. Water poured over the sides and several people screamed. But Sarah noticed something important. They were now only 30 yards from the beach. The waves were actually pushing them in the right direction. "Rico, on the next big wave, paddle hard to the left," she yelled. "We need to miss those rocks. The wave came like a moving wall of water, lifting their boat like a toy. Sarah and Rico paddled with all their strength, steering away from the coral reef. For a terrifying moment, it looked like they might flip over. But the boat surfaced right where Sarah had hoped, in the clear water just in front of the sandy beach. "This is it," Sarah shouted. "Everyone over the side. Head for shore!" She jumped into the chest-deep water first, then helped others down from the boat. The waves were still dangerous, trying to push people back out to sea or slam them into the nearby rocks. But Sarah moved through the water like she had been born there, pulling tourists toward safety one by one. The elderly German man couldn't swim well and was struggling against the current. Sarah reached him just as a wave was about to pull him under. She grabbed him around the chest and half-carried, half-dragged him toward shore. Behind her, Rico was helping the college students while the young mother held her toddler high above the waves. Within 10 minutes, all 15 tourists were safe on the beach, exhausted, but alive. Several people were cut from coral or bruised from being thrown around the boat, but no one was seriously injured. Sarah did a quick head count to make sure everyone had made it, then looked back at the water. What she saw made her heart sink. Their boat had already been smashed against the rocks and was breaking apart. But worse than that, she could see other boats in the distance still fighting the storm. Some were clearly in trouble, with people waving frantically for help. One boat had capsized completely, and she could see tiny figures in the water too far away for anyone to reach them. "Rico, how many other tour boats went out today?" she asked urgently. Rico was wringing water from his shirt, still in shock from their narrow escape. "Maybe 20 boats, all full of tourists. They all went to different islands." Sarah felt the weight of realization hit her. There weren't just 15 people in danger. There were potentially hundreds of tourists scattered across dozens of boats, all caught in the same deadly storm. And from what she could see, very few of them were going to make it to safety without help. She looked around at her group of survivors. They were safe for now, but they were on a remote beach with no way to communicate with the outside world. The nearest village was probably miles away through jungle terrain. Even if they started walking, it would take hours to reach help. And by then it would be too late for the people still trapped on the water. Mike, the college student who had been showing signs of hypothermia, was now sitting in the sand, still shivering despite being out of the wind. His girlfriend was trying to warm him up, but he needed dry clothes and shelter soon. The elderly German man was breathing hard and looked pale. The toddler was crying from fear and exhaustion. Sarah's immediate group needed care, but she couldn't stop thinking about all the others who were still in mortal danger. As if the storm wasn't enough, Sarah noticed something else that made her stomach drop. In the distance, she could see smoke rising from what looked like a large passenger ferry. It was much bigger than the tourist boats, probably carrying locals between islands, but it was clearly in distress, listing to one side and taking on water. If that ferry went down, it wouldn't be dozens of people at risk. It would be hundreds. Sarah made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days ago. Her quiet vacation was over. The combat pilot inside her had awakened, and she couldn't ignore the training that had kept her alive through 8 years of dangerous missions. She was the only person in this situation with the experience to coordinate a rescue operation. "Rico, I need you to take care of our group," she said, pulling him aside. "Get everyone up into those trees where they'll be protected from the wind. Use palm fronds to make shelter. Keep Mike warm and watch the old man's breathing." Rico looked confused. "Where are you going?" Sarah was already surveying the beach, looking for anything that could be useful. "I'm going to find a way to help those other boats. There has to be someone on this island with a radio or a boat that still works." "Sarah, that's crazy. The storm is too dangerous." She turned to face him, and Rico saw something in her eyes that made him step back. This wasn't the relaxed tourist he had met that morning. This was someone who had made life and death decisions before and wasn't afraid to make them again. "Rico, I spent 8 years as a combat pilot. I've been in worse situations than this and gotten everyone home safely. Those people out there are going to die unless someone helps them. I'm not going to sit on this beach and watch it happen." Before Rico could argue further, Sarah was already jogging down the beach looking for a path inland. She had spotted what looked like a small trail leading into the jungle. If there was a village nearby, that's where she would find help. If there wasn't, she would figure out another way. Failure wasn't an option when hundreds of lives were at stake. Sarah pushed through the jungle path as fast as she could while the storm raged overhead. Palm fronds whipped around her and rain poured down so hard she could barely see 10 feet ahead. Her clothes were soaked and torn from branches, but she kept moving. Somewhere behind her, Rico was taking care of the tourists. Somewhere ahead, she hoped to find help for the hundreds of people still trapped on the water. The path was muddy and treacherous, but it was clearly used regularly. That meant it led somewhere, hopefully to a village or at least a house with a radio. Every few minutes, she stopped to listen for sounds of civilization over the howling wind. After 20 minutes of difficult hiking, she heard something that made her heart race, the sound of a generator running. Following the noise, Sarah emerged from the jungle into a small clearing, where a weathered building sat surrounded by radio antennas and satellite dishes. A sign in multiple languages identified it as an emergency communication station. Through the windows, she could see someone inside working frantically at a radio console. Sarah pounded on the door until it opened, revealing a Filipino man in his 50s, wearing a Coast Guard uniform. His name tag read Lieutenant Santos, and his face showed the stress of someone dealing with multiple emergencies at once. "Please, I need your help," Sarah said breathlessly. "There are tourist boats all over the water in serious trouble. I just escaped from one myself." Lieutenant Santos looked her up and down, taking in her torn clothes and desperate expression. "You're American? Tourist?" "Yes, but I'm also a former military pilot. I have experience with emergency operations." "How many boats are reporting trouble?" Santos gestured for her to come inside, where she saw the full scope of the disaster. Multiple radio channels were crackling with distress calls. A large map on the wall showed the locations of various boats, marked with different colored pins. Red pins indicated boats in immediate danger, yellow ones were struggling but stable, and green ones had reached safety. Sarah's heart sank when she saw that red pins far outnumbered the others. 18 boats are in serious trouble, Santos explained quickly. The ferry Manila Star is taking on water with 320 passengers. Coast Guard vessels are responding, but the storm is too strong for normal rescue operations. We've lost contact with 6 boats completely. Sarah studied the map, her military training automatically analyzing the situation. The tourist boats were scattered across a wide area, making rescue coordination extremely difficult. The Coast Guard vessels marked on the map were all coming from the main port, which was over an hour away even in good weather. In this storm, they might not reach the most distant boats in time. "What about aircraft?" Sarah asked. "Helicopters?" Santos shook his head grimly. "Grounded. Wind speeds are too high for safe flight operations. Even our rescue helicopters can't operate in these conditions." Sarah felt a familiar frustration. In combat situations, she had often faced problems that seemed impossible to solve with conventional methods. But there was always another way, always an option that others hadn't considered. She studied the map more carefully, looking for patterns and opportunities. "Lieutenant, what's this marking here?" She pointed to a symbol near the center of the affected area. "That's Palawan Air Base, small military facility on an island about 15 miles from here. They have helicopters, but like I said, nothing is flying today." Sarah's mind raced. Military bases had more than just helicopters. They had experienced pilots who knew how to operate in dangerous conditions. They had rescue equipment designed for extreme situations. Most importantly, they had people trained to think creatively when normal procedures weren't enough. "I need to talk to the base commander," she said firmly. Santos looked at her like she was crazy. "Miss, with respect, they're not going to launch aircraft for civilians in this weather. It's too dangerous. They will if I explain the situation properly. What's the radio frequency?" Santos hesitated, but another urgent distress call came through the speakers. A boat with 12 tourists reported that they were taking on water faster than they could pump it out. They had maybe 30 minutes before going under completely. The Coast Guard vessel closest to them was still 45 minutes away. Sarah grabbed the radio microphone. "Palawan Air Base. This is former Air Force Captain Sarah Mitchell requesting immediate assistance with ongoing disaster relief operation." The response came back quickly. "Captain Mitchell, this is Colonel Reyes, base commander. What is your status and location?" Sarah had gambled that using her military rank and speaking in official terms would get attention. It worked. "Sir, I'm coordinating with Lieutenant Santos at the emergency communication station. We have multiple boats in distress with over 300 civilians at immediate risk of drowning. Request permission to discuss alternative rescue options." There was a long pause before Colonel Reyes responded. "Captain, weather conditions are beyond safe flight parameters. We cannot launch aircraft. Sir, I understand the risks, But I'm looking at a tactical situation that requires non-standard solutions. These people will die without immediate intervention. I have 8 years of combat flight experience, including operations in severe weather conditions. Request permission to brief you on possible options. Another pause, then. Captain Mitchell, report to base immediately for consultation. Lieutenant Santos will arrange transportation. Santos stared at her in amazement. How did you do that? The base commander never agrees to meetings during emergencies. Because I spoke his language, Sarah explained. Military commanders are trained to think about acceptable risk versus mission importance. Right now, the mission is saving 320 lives. That changes the calculation about what risks are acceptable. Santos quickly arranged for a local fisherman with a powerful motorboat to take Sarah to the airbase. The fisherman, Carlos, was the same man she had met at the Aviation Museum just days earlier. He recognized her immediately and didn't hesitate when Santos explained what they needed. Sarah, my friend, you are full of surprises, Carlos said as they prepared to leave. First you know aircraft, now you are organizing rescues. What else have you not told me? The boat ride to the airbase was harrowing. The storm was still raging and waves crashed over the bow constantly. But Carlos knew these waters better than anyone, and his boat was built to handle rough seas. They reached the base in 20 minutes, half the time it would have taken a normal vessel. The base was small but well equipped. Colonel Reyes met them at the dock, a serious man in his 40s with the bearing of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions. Sarah could see immediately that he was skeptical about whatever plan she might propose. Captain Mitchell, I've reviewed the weather data. Wind speeds are gusting to 70 miles per hour with zero visibility in the storm cells. No responsible pilot would attempt flight operations in these conditions. Sarah nodded respectfully. Sir, you're absolutely right about normal flight operations. But what about non-standard approaches? Water landings, low-altitude rescue techniques, or coordinated multi-vehicle operations? Colonel Reyes raised an eyebrow. You're suggesting we risk military aircraft and personnel on experimental rescue techniques? Sir, I'm suggesting we use every available resource to prevent the largest civilian disaster in this region's history. Sometimes the only way to minimize risk is to take calculated risks. Colonel Reyes led Sarah into the base operations center, where a team of officers was monitoring the storm and tracking the emergency situation. Multiple screens showed weather radar, radio communications, and the positions of Coast Guard vessels struggling to reach the distressed boats. The atmosphere was tense. Everyone knew that people were dying, but traditional rescue methods weren't working. Show me what you're thinking, Captain, Colonel Reyes said, gesturing toward a large tactical map. Sarah studied the display for several minutes, her combat experience automatically processing the complex situation. She had faced similar challenges in Afghanistan, where conventional approaches often failed and creative solutions saved lives. The key was thinking beyond normal procedures. Sir, what if we don't try to fly through the storm? She began. What if we fly around it and approach from the calmer side? Major Torres, the base flight operations officer, shook his head. The storm system is too large. Flying around it would take hours, and we'd still have to enter the worst weather to reach the boats. Sarah moved closer to the map, tracing potential flight paths with her finger. Not if we stage the operation differently. Look at this pattern. The storm is moving northeast, but it's not uniform. There are gaps between the worst cells where visibility is better and wind speeds are lower. She pointed to specific areas on the weather radar. If we time it right, aircraft could penetrate the storm at these points, reach the boats during brief clear periods, and extract people before the next weather cell arrives. It would require precise timing and multiple aircraft working in coordination. Colonel Reyes frowned thoughtfully. You're talking about threading the needle through a moving storm system. The timing would have to be perfect, yes sir, but it's possible. I've done similar operations in dust storms over Afghanistan. The principle is the same. Use the storm's own movement patterns against it. Don't fight the weather, work with its rhythm. Major Torres pulled up detailed weather projections on his computer. Even if we could identify windows of opportunity, our helicopters don't have the range to reach some of these boats and return safely. The ferry Manila Star is at the edge of our operational radius. Sarah had been thinking about this problem during the boat ride to the base. What about fuel efficiency modifications? Drop non-essential equipment, fly at optimal altitudes for fuel conservation, and establish refueling points using Coast Guard vessels. Refueling from ships in these conditions would be extremely dangerous, Colonel Reyes pointed out. More dangerous than letting 320 people drown? Sarah asked quietly. The room fell silent as everyone considered the stark reality of their situation. Through the radio speakers, they could hear another distress call. A tourist boat with engine failure was being pushed toward rocky cliffs. The Coast Guard vessel racing to help them was still 20 minutes away. Colonel Reyes made a decision that would define his career. Major Torres, I want options for modified rescue operations. Use Captain Mitchell's storm penetration theory. But I want detailed risk assessments for every phase. If we're going to do this, we're going to do it right. For the next hour, Sarah worked with the base's flight crew to develop a comprehensive rescue plan. They identified 3 helicopters that could be modified for extended range operations. They mapped out the storm's movement patterns and identified optimal penetration points. They established communication protocols with Coast Guard vessels that could serve as temporary refueling platforms. The plan was risky, but it was also their best chance of reaching the boats before they sank. Sarah volunteered to fly as co-pilot on the lead helicopter, using her combat experience to navigate through the storm cells. Colonel Reyes initially refused, pointing out that she wasn't certified on their aircraft. But Sarah convinced him that her weather flying experience was more valuable than formal certifications. As they prepared for the mission, Sarah felt the familiar pre-flight focus that had carried her through dozens of combat operations. The fear was there, it always was, but it was controlled and useful. Fear kept pilots alive by making them careful and thorough. The first helicopter lifted off just as weather conditions briefly improved. Sarah sat in the co-pilot seat, studying the storm radar and calling out navigation instructions to Captain Vega, the lead pilot. Behind them, the cargo bay had been stripped of everything except emergency rescue equipment and medical supplies. Flying into the storm was like entering another world. The helicopter was buffeted by winds that changed direction without warning. Rain hammered the windscreen so hard they could barely see their instruments. Lightning flashed around them constantly, and the radio crackled with static that made communication nearly impossible. But Sarah had been in worse conditions. During night raids in Afghanistan, she had flown through sandstorms that reduced visibility to 0, and electrical storms that made the aircraft shake like it was falling apart. The key was trusting instruments over instincts and maintaining constant communication with the other aircraft. Target boat bearing 270, distance 4 miles, she called out to Captain Vega. Storm cell moving northeast at 20 knots. We have approximately 12 minutes before conditions deteriorate. The first boat they reached was a small tourist vessel with 8 passengers clinging to life preservers in rough seas. The boat had capsized 20 minutes earlier, and several people were showing signs of hypothermia. Captain Vega brought the helicopter into a hover just above the water, while Sarah and the rescue swimmer prepared to extract survivors. The rescue operation required split-second timing. Each time a large wave approached, Captain Vega had to lift the helicopter higher to avoid being hit. When the water was calmer, he dropped down so the rescue swimmer could reach the survivors. One by one, they pulled 8 cold and terrified tourists into the helicopter. Storm cell approaching from the east, Sarah warned as they completed the first rescue. We need to clear the area in 3 minutes. They flew the survivors to a Coast Guard vessel that was serving as a temporary medical station, then immediately returned to the storm to search for the next boat in distress. The operation was working, but it was exhausting for both the aircraft and the crew. Every few minutes brought new challenges, changing wind directions, equipment problems, or communication difficulties. The second rescue was more difficult. They found a tour boat that was taking on water but hadn't yet sunk. The passengers were trapped in the cabin, and the boat was being pushed toward a coral reef that would tear it apart. Captain Vega had to position the helicopter directly over the boat, while survivors climbed up a rescue ladder in dangerous conditions. As they pulled the last tourist to safety, Sarah saw something on the radar that made her heart race. The ferry Manila Star was now showing as a stationary target, which meant it was no longer moving under its own power. If the largest vessel in the area had lost engine power, the 320 people aboard were in immediate danger of sinking. The radio crackled with desperate urgency as Sarah's helicopter approached the ferry Manila Star. The massive vessel was listing heavily to one side, taking on water faster than the pumps could handle it. Through the storm, Sarah could see hundreds of people crowded on the upper decks, many wearing life jackets but clearly terrified as waves crashed over the lower levels of the ship. Captain Vega, we need to get as close as possible, Sarah said, studying the scene below. That ferry is going down within the hour. We can't evacuate 300 people with helicopters, but we might be able to coordinate something else. As their helicopters circled the sinking ferry, Sarah noticed several smaller boats nearby, fishing vessels and Coast Guard cutters that had arrived to help but couldn't get close enough due to the dangerous conditions. The ferry was too large for the smaller boats to safely approach in the rough seas, and the helicopter couldn't lift more than a few people at a time. Then Sarah saw something that sparked an idea. About half a mile away, she spotted a large cargo ship that had been riding out the storm. It was much more stable than the smaller vessels and had the size to accommodate hundreds of people. The problem was getting the ferry passengers to the cargo ship safely. "Captain, patch me through to the ferry, Captain," Sarah requested. The radio connection was scratchy, but she managed to reach Captain Rodriguez of the Manila Star. His voice was strained with the effort of keeping his ship afloat while coordinating evacuation efforts. "Captain Rodriguez, this is Captain Mitchell coordinating air rescue operations. What's your current status? We have maybe 40 minutes before the ship goes under completely. Lower decks are flooded and we're losing power. 320 passengers and crew on board, mostly in the upper sections." Sarah quickly explained her plan. "Sir, there's a cargo vessel northwest of your position that could take all your passengers. If we can establish a boat bridge using the smaller vessels, we might be able to transfer everyone safely. The seas are too rough for small boat transfers. We'll lose people in the water." Sarah had anticipated this problem. "Not if we do it systematically. Use helicopters to transport safety lines between vessels. Create a guided pathway that keeps people connected to safety lines during transfer. It's risky, but it's better than staying on a sinking ship." While Captain Rodriguez considered the plan, Sarah coordinated with the other rescue helicopters in the area. They would need to work together to establish connections between the ferry, the smaller boats, and the cargo ship. It was the most complex rescue operation any of them had ever attempted. The next 2 hours tested everyone's limits. Helicopters flew back and forth through dangerous conditions, carrying safety equipment and establishing communication links between vessels. Sarah herself made 4 trips, each time fighting through wind and rain that threatened to knock the aircraft out of the sky. The evacuation began with children and elderly passengers. Small boats positioned themselves at carefully calculated intervals, creating a chain of safety between the sinking ferry and the stable cargo ship. Helicopter crews dropped rescue swimmers into the water to guide passengers during transfers and provide immediate help to anyone who fell overboard. Sarah watched from above as the first group of passengers made the terrifying journey from the ferry to the rescue boats. The process was slow and dangerous. Each person had to be individually guided across rough waters while connected to safety lines. But it was working. One by one, people were reaching safety. As the evacuation continued, Sarah noticed that the ferry was sinking faster than expected. The weight distribution had changed as people moved to different parts of the ship, and this was causing it to list even more severely. They were running out of time. "Captain Rodriguez, you need to evacuate the crew now," Sarah radioed urgently. "The ship's stability is compromised." "Don't wait for the last passengers." "I'm not leaving until everyone else is off," came the stubborn reply. Sarah understood the captain's sense of duty, but she also knew that if he stayed too long, he would go down with the ship and be unable to help anyone. She made a command decision that drew on all her military leadership experience. "Captain, this is a direct order from Rescue Command. You will evacuate with the next group. Your passengers need you alive to help coordinate their safety, not dead because of misplaced heroism." Something in her tone made Captain Rodriguez listen. Perhaps it was the authority she projected, or perhaps he recognized the voice of someone who had made similar life-and-death decisions before. Either way, he agreed to evacuate with the next group of passengers. With 30 minutes to spare before the ferry went under completely, the last passengers were transferred to safety. Captain Rodriguez was among the final group to leave his ship, and Sarah watched with relief as his boat reached the cargo vessel. 320 people had been saved from what should have been a disaster that killed hundreds. But the rescue wasn't over yet. The helicopters still needed to collect the survivors from various boats and transport them to medical facilities on shore. Many people were suffering from hypothermia, injuries, or shock. The elderly German man from Sarah's original tour group had developed pneumonia and needed immediate hospital care. As Sarah's helicopter made its final trip to shore, carrying the last group of rescued tourists, she felt the exhaustion hit her like a wave. She had been operating on adrenaline and training for over 6 hours, coordinating one of the most complex rescue operations in the region's history. Now that everyone was safe, her body was reminding her that she was human. The helicopter landed at a military hospital, where medical teams were waiting to treat the survivors. Sarah helped carry stretchers and provide information about each patient's condition during the rescue. Only when the last person had been admitted to the hospital did she finally allow herself to sit down. Colonel Reyes found her there an hour later, sitting in a hospital waiting room still wearing her torn and soaked clothes from the original boat accident. He had been coordinating the overall rescue operation from the base and had watched the entire mission unfold on radar. "Captain Mitchell, I want you to know that what you accomplished today will be remembered for a long time. 320 people are alive because you refused to accept that nothing could be done." Sarah looked up at him with tired eyes. "Sir, they're alive because everyone worked together. Your pilots, the Coast Guard crews, the boat captains, everyone did their part. I just helped coordinate." Colonel Reyes smiled. "A good leader always credits the team. But don't minimize your role. You saw possibilities that the rest of us missed. You took initiative when others hesitated. That's what leadership looks like in crisis situations." As Sarah finally returned to her hotel room that evening, she reflected on how dramatically her quiet vacation had changed. 3 days ago, she had been a burned-out former pilot trying to figure out what to do with her life. Now she had been reminded of what she was truly capable of when lives depended on her skills and judgment. The next morning, local newspapers carried headlines about the dramatic rescue operation. Sarah was mentioned as the American tourist who helped coordinate the effort, but she had specifically requested that the focus be on the Filipino rescue crews who had risked their lives to save others. She didn't want recognition. She just wanted to know that her skills had made a difference. As she prepared to extend her stay to help with the recovery efforts, Sarah realized that her vacation had become something much more important. She had found her purpose again, and she had discovered that leadership wasn't about rank or position. It was about taking responsibility when others needed help, regardless of whether it was your job or not.